Lazy. It's the word most of us use when we can't explain why we're not doing the things we know we should. But most of the time, it's the wrong diagnosis. Here's what I want to tell you. That word lazy is one of the most misused words in the psychology of human behavior. Not because laziness doesn't exist, but because most of the time, when people call themselves lazy, they're describing something else entirely. Something your brain recognizes even when you don't have a name for it yet. That something is burnout. And the difference between the two matters more than most people realize, because the way you treat laziness and the way you treat burnout are not just different. They're opposite. And if you've been treating one like it's the other, that's not a personal failure. That's a mistake anyone would make without the right information. So let's get into it. Laziness, properly defined, not used as an insult, is the preference for low-effort activities over high-effort ones when you actually have the capacity to do the hard thing. The key phrase there is, when you have the capacity. A lazy person, technically speaking, could do the thing. They have the energy. They have the focus. They just prefer not to use it. And here's something important. That's not always a problem. Rest is not laziness. Choosing ease when ease is appropriate is not laziness. Human beings are not designed to be maximally productive every hour of every day. Evolution built us to conserve energy when possible, because for most of human history, wasting energy was genuinely dangerous. The preference for rest is not a character flaw. It's a survival feature. True laziness, the problematic kind, shows up when someone consistently avoids effort not because they're depleted, but because they've never developed a tolerance for the discomfort that hard work requires. And even that is usually a learned behavior, not a fixed personality trait. But that's not what most people are experiencing when they call themselves lazy. Not even close. Burnout is something that took researchers a surprisingly long time to take seriously. The term was coined in the 1970s by a psychologist named Herbert Freudenberger, who used it to describe what he was seeing in volunteers at a free clinic, people who had started the work full of idealism and gradually became exhausted, cynical, and ineffective. He called it burning out, the way a candle burns out. It gives everything it has, and then it has nothing left. For decades, burnout was treated as a niche occupational problem. Something that happened to caregivers, social workers, emergency personnel. The rest of the world largely ignored it. Then the data started coming in, and it turned out burnout was everywhere. Studies began showing burnout in lawyers, teachers, software engineers, parents, students, athletes, and increasingly, in people whose work never fit a traditional job description at all. People managing chronic illness, raising children under financial pressure, surviving difficult relationships, or simply trying to maintain a functional life in an era of constant information overload and social comparison. The World Health Organization officially recognized burnout as an occupational phenomenon in 2019, not a lifestyle choice, not a weakness, a legitimate, identifiable condition with measurable neurological and physiological markers. And then, almost immediately after that announcement, a global pandemic arrived and produced the largest collective burnout event in modern history. So what is burnout exactly at the level of your brain and body? Burnout researchers Christina Maslech and Michael Later identified three core dimensions. Understanding all three matters because burnout doesn't always look like exhaustion. Sometimes it shows up in ways that are much harder to recognize. The first is emotional and physical exhaustion. This is what most people picture, a kind of depletion that sleep doesn't fix. You wake up tired. You go through the day tired. You do nothing on the weekend and you're still tired on Monday. This isn't regular fatigue. Regular fatigue responds to rest. Burnout exhaustion is deeper. It's the system running on fumes after the reserves have been empty for a long time. The second dimension is depersonalization, sometimes called cynicism. This is where things get less obvious. It means a gradual emotional distancing from the things that used to matter. The work that once felt meaningful starts to feel pointless. The relationships that once energized you start to feel like obligations. You notice yourself becoming detached, going through motions, caring less. From the outside, this can look like a personality shift. From the inside, it often feels like something has quietly died, and you're not sure when it happened. The third dimension is a reduced sense of personal accomplishment, what some researchers call efficacy erosion. Even when you complete tasks, they don't feel like achievements. The satisfaction that used to come from finishing something has gone quiet. You might look at a full day of work and feel nothing, or look at months of progress and still feel like you're failing. This is your brain's reward system running low, not just your mood, but the underlying neurological machinery that generates motivation and meaning. Now here's where the confusion between burnout and laziness becomes really important to understand. When you're burned out and you can't make yourself do something, it doesn't feel like exhaustion. It feels like resistance. It feels like avoidance. It feels from the inside exactly like what you'd expect laziness to feel like. You're sitting there. The task is there. You're not doing it. What else would you call that? But what's actually happening at the neurological level is something very different. Your brain has a threat detection system, the amygdala, and a reward and motivation system centered around dopamine pathways in the prefrontal cortex. When these systems are healthy and balanced, difficult tasks feel hard but doable. There's some friction, but there's also a pull, the anticipation of satisfaction, the experience of progress, the dopamine hit that comes from completion. Burnout disrupts this balance. Chronic stress and sustained overload cause your nervous system to shift into a state of conservation. Your brain essentially makes a calculation. We're running low on resources, so we're going to start restricting access to them. Motivation becomes harder to generate. Focus becomes harder to sustain. The reward signal that normally makes effort feel worthwhile gets quieter and quieter. This is not a choice. This is not a preference. This is your brain protecting itself. And here's the cruel irony. The very thing burnout causes, the inability to start, the difficulty concentrating, the sense of not caring, the avoidance, looks and feels identical to laziness from the outside. And often from the inside too. Which is why so many burned-out people spend months or years pushing themselves harder, calling themselves lazy, adding more pressure to a system that is already overwhelmed, and then wondering why nothing improves. There are a few key differences that can help you tell them apart. These aren't foolproof. Human psychology is always more complicated than a checklist, but they're meaningful signals. The first is how you respond to rest. Laziness is about preference when you have the capacity. So a genuinely low-effort day, a day where you truly rest, do nothing, watch things you enjoy, sleep well, will leave a lazy person feeling fine, refreshed, even, ready to go. A burned-out person doesn't recover that quickly. You can take a weekend completely off and return Monday feeling nearly the same as you left Friday. You can take a vacation and find yourself dreading the return before you've even unpacked. The depletion doesn't resolve with a good night's sleep because it's not a sleep deficit. It's a systemic depletion that accumulated over months or years. The second is your history with the thing you're avoiding. Ask yourself, was there ever a time when this felt different? When you had energy for it, enthusiasm for it, some version of wanting to do it? If yes, and especially if you can identify a period when things shifted, that's important information. True laziness is generally consistent. Burnout typically has a before and after. Something changed, even if you can't pinpoint exactly when. The third is the presence of guilt. This one surprises people. Laziness, in its genuine form, tends to come with relatively low guilt. If you prefer low effort and you're choosing low effort, there's a kind of congruence there. Burned out people, in contrast, often experience crushing guilt. They want to do the thing. They feel terrible that they're not doing it. They sit in the avoidance feeling awful about themselves, unable to move, the guilt making the paralysis worse. This is not the experience of someone who prefers ease. This is the experience of someone whose system has run out of fuel while the engine is still trying to run. The fourth is whether more effort makes things better or worse. If you're lazy in the genuine sense, applying external pressure, a deadline, an accountability partner, changing your environment tends to produce results. The capacity was there. It just needed a nudge. If you're burned out, adding pressure often backfires. You might push through in the short term, but the underlying depletion gets worse. Each push costs more than it produces. The well gets emptier. And what started as burnout can, over time, become something more serious: clinical depression, anxiety disorders, physical health problems, a level of exhaustion from which recovery takes not weeks but months. Let's talk about what causes burnout, because this is where a lot of people are surprised. The popular image of burnout is someone working 80-hour weeks at a high-pressure job. And yes, that will cause burnout. But burnout doesn't require dramatic overwork. It requires sustained expenditure without adequate recovery. Those are two different things. You can burn out from a moderate workload if the emotional demands are high enough. You can burn out from caregiving for a parent, a child, a partner with chronic illness, without ever working a formal job. You can burn out from a relationship that requires constant emotional management. You can burn out from chronic financial stress, from long-term uncertainty, from being a person in a world that delivers a continuous stream of alarming information and expects you to keep functioning normally. One of the most under-recognized causes of burnout is what researchers call the effort-reward imbalance. When you consistently put significant effort into something, work, relationships, creative projects, caregiving, and the reward you receive is insufficient, inconsistent, or absent, your brain's motivation system gradually disengages. The dopamine feedback loop breaks down. Effort stops feeling worth it because, from your brain's perspective, it hasn't been worth it for a long time. Another major contributor is lack of control. When you're working hard at something but feel like you have no agency over outcomes, no ability to influence decisions, set boundaries, or change the conditions you're working in, the stress that results is qualitatively different from hard work with autonomy. It's the difference between running a difficult race and running on a treadmill where someone else controls the speed. The exertion might be similar. The psychological impact is not. And then there's the one nobody talks about enough: the lack of permission to stop. Many people who burn out don't burn out because they didn't recognize the warning signs. They burn out because they recognized the signs and kept going anyway, because they didn't feel they were allowed to stop, because other people were counting on them, because stopping felt selfish, because they'd internalized the message somewhere along the way that their worth was tied to their productivity. And so they kept going past the warning signs and then past the point of depletion until their body and brain made the decision for them. Recovery from burnout is real. It happens. But it requires understanding what burnout actually is, and specifically, it requires resisting the instinct to treat it the way you treat laziness. If you think you're lazy, the logical response is more pressure, push harder, set stricter deadlines, remove distractions, build discipline, get uncomfortable. If you're burned out, more pressure makes things worse. What burned out nervous systems need is the opposite of pressure. They need genuine recovery, not the performative rest of a Saturday spent feeling guilty about what you're not doing, but actual disengagement, space, reduction of demand, permission to exist without producing. They need the effort-reward balance to be restored. They need some degree of control to be returned, small decisions, small agency, the ability to shape at least part of your own experience. And perhaps most importantly, they need the story about themselves to change. Because you cannot recover from burnout while calling yourself lazy. The label matters. The framing matters. A person who believes they're failing due to laziness applies more pressure. A person who understands they're depleted starts looking for ways to refill. If any of this has sounded familiar, if you've been sitting with the guilt of tasks undone and the exhaustion of trying to push through and the quiet shame of not being able to explain why you can't seem to function at the level you used to, I want to offer you something. Not a solution, not a 5-step plan, just a reframe. What if you're not failing? What if you're depleted? What if the part of you that can't start isn't broken, it's just empty? What if the most important thing you could do right now isn't to try harder, but to take seriously what your brain has been trying to tell you for a while? Your brain knows the difference between burnout and laziness, even when you don't have the words for it yet. It's been sending signals, the exhaustion that doesn't lift, the guilt that doesn't motivate, the distance from things that used to matter, the sense that something has changed even if you can't say when. Those signals aren't weakness. They're information. And information is always the starting point for change. If this felt useful, my last video was about why you can't put your phone down. And I mean actually why, not the just delete the apps advice. It connects to a lot of what we talked about today. Links somewhere on screen. And if you want more of this kind of thing, subscribe. Stick and I will see you in the next one.